Hello and welcome to the Mastermind, Body, and Spirit Show. I'm your host, Matt Belair. Today's guest is a veteran journalist and communications consultant who enjoyed a 25-year career working on environmental business magazines, during which time he won an unprecedented 14th Kenneth R. Wilson Awards for Excellence in Business Journalism. His freelance feature articles have appeared in mainstream media such as the Globe and Mail, Saturday Night Magazine, and other national publications. He has twice been a finalist at the National Magazine Awards. After a long trip to the Peruvian Amazon in late 2013, he left his job to consult and write freelance articles and books, focusing on environmental issues and spiritual themes such as Amazonian plant shamanism. He also sits on the board of several philanthropic organizations, including the Amazon Rainforest Conservancy, to which all his royalties from his book, The Year of Drinking Magic, are donated. He is the founder of a new group called the Rainbow Warriors that's organizing people concerned about the rollout of the invasive technology of the Fourth Industrial Revolution and its facial recognition cameras and dystopian immunization passports. Welcome to the show, Guy Crittenden.
Hello, brother. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, man. We're new fast friends. We've been paying attention very closely to what is going on in the world today. And I was noticing that a lot of your posts were similar to mine. You're a journalist by trade, which is amazing. It's helpful for me to try to share the information that I'm getting, and getting to know you a little bit over the last week and just looking at what you're writing. When you're doing the research and you're really trying to figure out what is going on here, it seems like all roads are kind of intersecting in a common direction. And you've recently written something called the Corporate Coup D'État, and you're not the only one to find these same connections because it's all public documents. And what I'll do is I'll just welcome you to the show. And before we dive into all this stuff, because I'm very curious your take, how did you get into what you're doing today? Talk a little bit about your transition and just what you're trying to bring out to the world now, because I think like you and I, we're facing a lot of criticism. It's a very intense time. And I'm just curious your path to get to where you are right now.
Okay, well, there's a longer answer, but I'll start with the short one about just what's been going on for the past couple of months. As you said in the intro and my bio sketch, which I now realize I need to shorten a little. Thank you for indulging me with that. Back in the day when I was editing some environmental business publications with a small company that I was a co-founder of, and then we sold to a conglomerate. I worked for a while with, we had some office space in our old digs down at Spadina and Richmond in Toronto. And we rented out some space. We had an empty office, and our company helped an organization that exists to this day called the Ontario Environment Industry Association, which has ONIA, which has sister publications or organizations in Quebec and out west and in the Maritimes. And the first executive director of ONIA was a gentleman by the name of Gary Gallen, who became a friend of mine. And Gary was one of the founders of Greenpeace. Now, not a lot of people recognize his name because he didn't go on to become officially part of the organization when it became very successful. But he was living in Vancouver back in around Earth Day 1970 when that all got started. And he was, the proverbial kind of hippie lying down in front of bulldozers and involved. And he had some great stories about the early days of Greenpeace and how it was so chaotic. The way they managed their finances, for instance, was checks started coming in the mail, and they would just be in a giant pile on the floor. And whenever they needed money, one of the people would go over and just open a check and make a bank deposit, and that would cover a few days' expenses. It was really, really crazy times, and quite romantic in a way. And so through Gary, who I became quite good friends with, I eventually met Bob Hunter, who was really the founder and leader of Greenpeace and the visionary. Now, I didn't become as close friends to Bob Hunter as Gary, but I did get to know him. And at that time, his Greenpeace days were behind him, and he was doing a show for City TV in Toronto, and he had a regular column in one of the weekly entertainment magazines or newspapers in Toronto. So we hung out a few times. We had a kind of playful relationship. I would tease him, he would tease me. He once called me an environmental criminal in print, because I'd written something that, this was the mid-90s, you got to remember, was a bit skeptical about the climate change projections. So anyway, we had this kind of teasing relationship. So anyway, what happened, fast forward, probably 30 years now, and all of what's going on in the world with COVID-19 came to my attention, and initially I supported the lockdown or the sheltering at home strategy, because I thought, well, the government is asking us to, flatten the curve, and there's a new virus, and they needed a few weeks to get organized and get medical resources in place like beds and respirators. Well, of course, after about a month, I started to wonder what was going on, because I thought, well, surely by now the hospitals have these resources in place. And reports started to come out about these hospitals being mostly empty. Some of them were busy in some locations, but some of the hospitals had not seen the surge that they'd expected. And then my whole feeling about this pandemic, which we'll get into later, started to change, and I started to regard this as the beginning of an possible assault on or infringement on our civil liberties, because it was weird. The story changed. We were asked to shelter at home for a very specific reason, and then the lockdown, as it became called, was continued and continued and continued with no explanation that we were never told. It was sort of like a vague, well, we got to be safe. And then Premier Ford in Ontario, where I live, came out and said, oh, we have to save every precious human life. Well, okay, so you're locking down and destroying an entire economy because you don't want to save a single human life. And the logic of this started to become questionable. And so, tracking back to why I told you the story about Greenpeace, I was sitting at home one day. I almost had a kind of dream. And I remembered seeing a piece of film that I'd seen in a documentary about the founding of Greenpeace. And I think it was in that film, I'm not sure, but it showed Bob Hunter standing on the ice floes in Newfoundland, I presume during a protest against the annual seal hunt. And a huge icebreaker ship was coming straight at him down the strait. And he was just standing there with his arms folded, staring it down, playing the ultimate game of chicken. Now, these ships don't stop on a dime. So he was taking an extreme risk, because the captain of that ship would have had to start stopping the boat and putting the propellers in reverse a long time before he got close to Bob. And as this footage showed, the ship comes toward Bob, and it ends up only stopping a few meters from him. And he was at risk of death or injury being plunged into those frigid waters. And so what I thought to myself was, if Bob Hunter died a number of years ago, as did Gary Gallen, of forms of cancer. And I thought to myself, if Bob Hunter were alive today, would he be trembling in his basement, wondering what the next thing is that the government would tell him to do? I don't think so. A guy like Bob Hunter, and we need people like him today, he would have organized. He would have started resisting. He certainly, as a journalist, which was his main profession, would have started asking a lot of questions, which I was already doing. And so anyway, it inspired me to organize a group. We started on Facebook about a month ago. We're over 140 members now, and we're growing like weeds. And I'm starting to get calls from people all across the country. And I'll probably get more people because of this podcast, which I appreciate. So we have a Facebook group called Rainbow Warriors, and we've also might move to another platform that shall remain nameless for now, where we do our actual organizing for, be it protests or resistance to things like dangerous 5G microwave technology that's being installed while we're all sheltering at home and we can't get out to protest or raise awareness with our elected officials and so on. And everything related to this. We're very concerned about a mandatory vaccine. I'm trying to guide the group to not get bogged down in the whole vaccine issue on a broader scale because the Overton window of our society does not allow that discussion. But even people who might take the shot themselves could be perhaps persuaded to understand that having it be a mandatory thing, or even if it's not mandatory, they could make it, you know, the Bill Gates WHO model seems to be that, well, if you don't take the vaccine, then you might not be able to renew your driver's license or your passport, or you might not be able to get into certain restaurants or concert stadiums. So it doesn't have to be mandatory. It can be made somewhat compulsory. So there's a few issues that we're dealing with, among others. And we're at the point now where we are protesting the lockdown. I've been looking very closely at Sweden and the results they're getting there. And not everyone, but some people like to say, oh, but Sweden's deaths are higher than the surrounding countries like Norway and Finland that did the lockdown. But first of all, they didn't crash their economy. Secondly, they did do some social distancing, but they won't have the sickness and the depression and the suicides and the illness from a failure to diagnose early for various diseases. So if we were to add from even just the Scandinavian countries other than Sweden, if we were to look at all those deaths and all of the suffering and the economic calamity, I think Sweden is emerging as an example of a sane and prudent response to this virus. And even the WHO, which I think is, even the WHO acknowledged that and said that Sweden was a model for the world, which was a very strange thing. And I don't know why they said that, but I think maybe they realize this might not go well for them in the end. And they don't want to be on record as never having said that Sweden was good. They want to position themselves so that if they get criticized later, they can say, no, we supported what Sweden did, which they certainly were not promoting that model in the past. Anyway, that was a long rambling answer. I promise I won't just ramble like that to everything you asked me.
No, I hope you do. I love the rambles. It opens up for the next set of questions because I listened to, I think it's Anders Tegnell, right, is the guy heading up the Swedish response. And he was on an interview and he was talking about some of these things. And one of the very apparent side effects, if you will, there's probably a better way to phrase that, but all of the deaths and all of the harm that is coming from the lockdown. So a lot of people really wanting the lockdown to stay in place, usually they're okay financially, but there's a lot of people that have lost their jobs. I think a conservative estimate is 30% will lose the small businesses and millions on unemployment. Obviously, when the lockdown ends, some of it will come back. And you look at, I've seen a lot of your reports and your journalism. It's similar to what I'm finding. It's like, okay, well, how dangerous is this? Well, The doctors are coming out now saying it's 98% recovery. The average is 0.2. And this is all public data. You can find this. And then you start looking at what kind of agenda is being put forth. And you're looking at how different countries are reacting. And so even just Sweden, for example, their economy is going to be okay, which is huge. I remember Robert Kennedy did a post about how with each 1% of unemployment, how there's increased deaths, increased suicide, increased abuse, increased alcoholism, all this kind of stuff to be considered in the long run, and what's going to happen to a country, what's going to happen to its people. Because, you know, like he said, he's like, we need to take care of the sick and those who are at risk. And if you look at the deaths in Sweden by age, a lot of them are very, very, very high. Like, I think most of them were 80 or 90 years old, and that's a part of life. It's an unfortunate part that some will lose our older people, but 80 to 90 years old is the highest bracket. And that came from World Meters. And so somebody sent that to me because I was asking, what's going on with Sweden, right? Is it as bad as they're saying? Is it worse that they're saying? Let's get to the bottom of this, because in your investigations, you've seen this like me, that the numbers were inflated. Doctors were pressured to increase the numbers. And all these other things, nurses coming out in New York City talking about malpractice and things like that. And when you start to really look under the hood of this thing, there's a lot of suspicious interests, that are unfolding. And so I'm curious if you want to give us an overview of what you've been finding when you started to investigate this and some of the connections that you've made.
Okay, well, when you told me that we were going to do this in a video format, I got a couple. I don't have many visual props, but I have a couple. So I just thought I would actually show this because this is a good segue. This is actually a screen grab, which probably won't show very well here. So apologies, this is just low tech, but on my iPad, I'm just sharing. This is my article called "Plandemic, COVID-19 and the Corporate Coup D'État," and that is, people can find that on my website, it's a new website, and I'm just starting to archive material and publish material there, because I've been writing for a bunch of different consciousness shift websites and other websites, and my stuff is scattered all over the place. So I started a website called HIP. I'm going to first say it, but then I'm going to spell it, because the way it's spelled is not what you'd think. My website is called hypnosis.co. So first of all, it's not a .com, it's a .co, and I did that because that has better security. And hypnosis, it's hip, HIP, and then gnosis, GNOSIS. So it's like hip, sacred knowledge. So anyway, people go to hypgnosis.co. They can find my article there under the articles tab. And to answer your question, I spent a lot of time poring over the numbers, and I started this group in the spirit of Bob Hunter called Rainbow Warriors. And I was doing all, like you have, I'm sure, experienced the same thing. I was having a lot of stuff coming at me. And once I started that group, I got overwhelmed with the number of articles and links people were sending me. But anyway, it was an embarrassment of riches, because I had a lot of research material at hand. And I found, similarly to what others have found, that if you go past the sensational numbers, I can't stand to turn on CBC or the state or corporate media right now, because every time I turn it on, they say, oh, there's 70 new cases of COVID in such and such community, or there's 30 new cases in this province. I think that's just totally meaningless. I mean, in fact, if you believe in herd immunity, you want people, not elderly, infirm people with existing conditions, but you want younger people to get this and to build the herd immunity. And there are therapies we can talk about if you want later, with some of those malaria type disease drugs that do offset the bad symptoms that a very small minority of people have. anyway, I found that if you really crunch the numbers, which I do in this article for Canada and for the province of Ontario, where I happen to have really good data, yeah, you're coming in. I'm not saying this thing is the same as the flu, but certainly the fatality rate is down. Let's call it in 0.2 to 0.5%, like 0.5% maybe. It's obviously higher for people in old folks' homes who have 2 or 3 pre-existing conditions. And even there, you got to wonder at the numbers, because let's say, and I don't mean to be insensitive in saying this, but if somebody is in an old age home and they have terminal cancer, and let's say they were going to die anyway on Saturday, and they have COVID-19 as a comorbidity, maybe they die on Thursday, or maybe they die on Saturday, but they die with this, but they don't die from it. And we've all heard this. I don't know why some people don't grok that, but certainly the Swedish model is coming out looking really good. I think it was South Dakota in the States where I might be wrong, but there was one of the states where they threw a parade for the governor because she had not done the lockdown, and the results for her state were similar to all the neighboring states. So there's another example of another way we can go. And my research is showing that the next time we have one of these pandemics, we should never do this again. I mean, this has just been a disaster on a global scale. And I think when we look at the economic fallout and the economic calamity, we'll realize that, I mean, I'm not unreasonable, okay? Like, let's say this was an Ebola type disease and 1 in 4 people were dying. Of course, I would go for this kind of more extreme reaction. But when you have 98.5% of people showing either no symptoms or minimal symptoms, and it's mostly like a cold, and then children, it turns out, don't really get it at all, and they don't transfer it to other people. So there's no reason that our schools should be closed right now. So you just look at it systematically and you just find we've gone in a wrong direction. Now, why we've gone in that wrong direction is a subject of speculation. And depending on your own confirmation bias, you will tend to go down one of several different tracks with that. I've been really trying to resist going down the conspiracy track, and yet there really are conspiracies, let's face it. Not every conspiracy theory is correct, but that doesn't mean that there are not conspiracies. And whether we call it a conspiracy or not, and whether it was planned in a particular way, and whether the virus was released from Wuhan intentionally or not, although the timing is very suspicious. Certainly global capital has taken advantage of this to roll out an agenda that it has formulated before this pandemic, and they were clearly waiting for a crisis to turn into an opportunity to roll out the technologies of what is called the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is what my article mostly talks about. And, I'll pause and you can ask me about that or some aspect of this.
Yeah, you brought up a lot of great points there. I remember when I was looking at the death toll rise, for me, if this thing is a super scary thing and we're all, it's a 25%, death rate of healthy people, and we need to lock down, and that's going to help everybody. I'm totally cool with that. But when you start seeing all this really suspicious stuff of inflated numbers, senators speaking out, doctors speaking out, nurses speaking out, and you're seeing that the numbers are inflated and something isn't quite right, then, you flash forward, and I can't remember which minister it was, but it was a minister in Italy, and he's, there's a video of him freaking out, just saying, we didn't have 25,000 people die of this. We had them die of, cancer, and then they had COVID. They had all these other pre-existing conditions. And so when I get kind of a little pushback from people, some people have been upset about what I'm posting, and I'm like, I'm just trying to find the truth. Have you found an article that showed me that COVID is more deadly than, you know, a 98% recovery? Most people dying are dying of something that they have pre-existing conditions. And when I went all the way back to this, I actually went, you go right back to germ theory versus terrain theory. And, you know, that's such an important distinction right now. I knew a little bit of it, but, you know, the very Cole's Notes overview is it's between, you know, Anton Béchamp and Louis Pasteur. And Pasteur was a chemist. Béchamp had 4 PhDs, was a doctor, incredibly brilliant. He was, he held 4 seats at the Lille University, which was very prestigious. And he talked about the terrain, basically saying it's all about the body. You know, if you have a diseased body, you know, you're going to create the virus or the exosome within you. And one of the best examples I had explained to me, because I was trying to wrap my head around it, but I think it's Sebi, and this guy's something Sebi, and he was apparently curing people of AIDS, and he got taken to court and he won those cases. But he's you know, I'm just learning about him as well. But he said, you know, if you take an apple and you put it in an encased so nothing can get in it, and then you come back 2 weeks later and there's worms coming in. How did those worms get there? They didn't fly in there. They were created from the environment. And that's a very important distinction. And Dr. Zach Bush just did you know, he's been doing podcasts recently, and hopefully he'll come on mine. But, you know, he explains it so well, and he's such a brilliant mind, and just talks about all these other factors and how, you know, those are what's going to, he's like the COVID-19 will kind of create a condition to open up other things. But if you're healthy and you're vibrant and your microbiome and all that's in order, you have nothing to worry about. So we have all of these really brilliant doctors speaking out. Dr. Rashid Buttar, Dr. Bruce Lipton. You know, we have Judy Mikovits speaking out.
Judy Mikovits,
you know, and she's getting like, you know, everyone's like, oh, she's baloney. But like, I watch her speak versus Fauci, and then, you know, Fauci, you know, Robert Kennedy Jr. speaking out about him. There's a lot of people speaking out. And then you look at the financial interests. And I know you've documented some of this as well as I have. You know, which groups are these people in, and do they have a financial stake in the game? And how do you kind of raise up in the political world? And so when I factor all these things in, one has just a little bit more weight, but I listen to both sides. The problem is, if you're only listening to one side and it's mainstream news A and B, you're not going to get both sides of the story. There's always 2 sides of the story. And when you take that information in, you can then have more information to base your opinion on. And then as new information arises, you can revise that opinion. And so I'd love for you to share what you discovered going down those rabbit holes, because I think it's very relevant, you know, and following the money trail, following the information trail, it just leads in one direction. And I get worried when they talk about forced vaccinations. You know, that's a scary idea. Why do we need forced vaccinations? Why is there such a massive increase in YouTube censorship? Right. And we're kind of going down this rabbit hole, the Facebook fact check, who's fact checking that? And it goes against the World Health Organization.
Yeah, it's the Atlantic Council and these neocons. If you look at who the actual fact checkers are, they're not independent, unbiased organizations or people. They are right-wing groups that are supporting very much, like if you liked free trade agreements and exporting of jobs and globalist agendas and putting countries into austerity, it's that crowd that is actually doing the censoring. So it's part of a larger agenda for sure. People can look that up for themselves. A lot of people don't realize that Snopes is now not an independent organization. It's not just the man and the woman in their apartment with their cat. That's been infiltrated or taken over by the deep state. WikiLeaks, the entry about Dr. Judy Mikovits on WikiLeaks is a smear. A lot of people don't realize that you can have somebody could create a biography on WikiLeaks about me. I hope I'm not giving anyone an idea here. And I better get in there and create my own one first. But what happens is falsehoods are published on not WikiLeaks. I always do that. I apologize. I meant
Wikipedia.
Wikipedia. Sorry, WikiLeaks is great. I always make that mistake. Wikipedia is those bios in there can be very distorted and misleading, and people try for years to get the wrong information fixed. And so I have shared some of Judy Mikovits's material, like the 30 minutes that are going to end up in this Plandemic documentary that's being made, which is a fantastic segment. Everybody needs to see that. Well, of course, it's being pulled down and scrubbed from YouTube and social media every time it's put up, with sometimes within minutes. But the Wikipedia entry, like I've sent it to people, and I sent it to one friend who has relatives who are doctors, and he said, "Oh, they just went over to Wikipedia and they read the entry. This woman is a known fraudster, and she went to jail for malpractice." And I'm like, are you really that naive? But that is how many people are. If it fits their confirmation bias, then it's incredible how easy it is actually to discredit somebody, and it's a real shame. I think, however, that the globalists and the people promoting the dangerous technologies, and they are dangerous, have overplayed their hand. And I'm starting to see a lot of people putting up memes telling Bill Gates that he can take his vaccine and shove it. So I think I'm actually, sometimes now when I see these really over the top messages from Gates and the people who support what he's trying to do, I'm almost thankful, because they've gone so far, it's actually waking some people up. And the censorship, I've never seen anything like it. You cannot now share a contrarian point of view. And with my Rainbow Warriors group, and even on my own Facebook page, we routinely have to deliberately spell words in a strange way, like vaccines. We have to spell it with asterisks, and 5G, the new internet microwave technology. We have to spell that in a weird way, because if you spell those words in any kind of normal way, that's red meat for the censors. And even so, some of my friends are getting shadow banned. I'm seeing groups shut down. I've seen several excellent sites that I used to send people to or pages and groups on Facebook are gone now. Some of them had thousands of followers. So we're not even allowed to discuss science. And I won't be heavy-handed with that, because I think this has been discussed elsewhere. And there are people like you said, Robert Kennedy Jr. and Del Bigtree, and some other whistleblowers and truth tellers out there who are getting that message out. I'm very pleased to see that Brian Rose has this Freedom platform, and he's going to be interviewing Dr. Mikovits on it. I know
they already did. I watched most of it.
Yeah, I haven't seen it yet. I know he had David Icke on, and I agree with some of what Icke says, and I disagree with other things he says. It's kind of a pity that he got the most views with that one guy, because there's other people who talk about the same kinds of subjects that I don't have sort of the drawbacks of Icke, in my opinion. But anyway, I'm still glad that he was able to get the interviews out, and I don't believe in censorship. So it's just great that he got to speak his mind. And I hope that people look past that one interview and look at the other material out there. Speaking of voices of reason out there, one person I've been enjoying is someone I only got to know recently. There's a woman by the name of Kim Iverson on YouTube. That's Kim Iverson. She has her own show, and she talks very sensibly about the data and everything to do with this in a way that I think you would appreciate. And one of her themes, and this is not discussed enough, is like, what's the plan for where we go from here? And what she has said, and other people are now picking up on it, is, we've had all these people in lockdown, out of the sun, not being exposed to microbes in soil and all that stuff. When the lockdown ends, it's almost 100% guaranteed that there's going to be a surge. And the policymakers are going to be inclined to put us back into lockdown. And this is something that we have got to resist. We do need to shift to some amount of herd immunity. I would assume that some of this pandemic, this virus, will disappear in the hot weather of the summer anyway, but it could come back in the fall. And this is where we need to really educate our peers and our neighbors and start saying, look, this is a failed strategy. It's been an interesting experiment, but it's crashed economies around the world. And essentially what is happening, and Dylan Ratigan has been talking about this a lot on his own YouTube show, and he's a regular guest now on the Jimmy Dore show on YouTube that I'm a huge fan of. Jimmy Dore is one of the few truth tellers in the business right now. Strange that a stand-up comic has to do journalism, whereas, you know, CNN and the New York Times and Washington Post just suck. It feels so good to have a platform to even be able to say that. But Dylan Ratigan and Jimmy Dore have been exploring the extent, especially in the United States, that doesn't have Canada's social welfare support for people, which has been not too bad. But in the States, the ruling class of the United States has thrown the people under the bus repeatedly. And just as they did in 2008, they're giving money they're bailing out Wall Street and not Main Street. And the amount of foreclosures that are going to be coming are going to be extraordinary. And I think we will see some of this in every country in the world. Ratigan was saying that one of the trends that's most disturbing in the States is that apparently by law down there, you can go 6 months without making your mortgage payments if you have financial stress before you can be foreclosed on. And what the banks are doing is they're engaging in predatory practices, and they're sending letters to people saying it's basically setting a trap for them so that they can be foreclosed on. And the deal is something like, you get this letter, and it sounds very authoritative, and it says, you know, we'll give you a 3-month, not 6 month, a 3-month holiday from mortgage payments. But at the end of the 3 months, you have to pay it all back as what's called a balloon payment. And the people don't read the fine print. And some of the people sign these things that they don't have to, but they sign it thinking it's a great deal. And what is going to happen is in 3 months, when they can't pay the whole thing, they've already pre-authorized the bank to take their home. And they've already surrendered their right to fight it in court. So this is the worst kind of predation. So under Obama, 5 million American families were thrown out of their homes. So that's not individuals, that's families. So that's probably 15 or 20 million people. And a lot of those people never recovered. We're going to see it again. It's going to be another wave. So you're going to see this in the US, you're going to see it in Canada, Australia, the UK, all over the industrialized world. The next 18 months to 24 months, global capital and transnational corporations are going to consolidate the assets not already under their control. What this will mean in terms of what we see in our daily lives is you're going to see the Amazons, the Walmarts, the McDonald's restaurants, the chain restaurants, the big agribusinesses, the Monsantos. They are going to not only survive this time, but they're going to do very well. And they're going to have much more control over the economy. What you're going to see, and I'm already seeing it where I live, you're going to see boarded up storefronts. You're going to be seeing restaurants out of business. You're going to see small mom and pop businesses, things we can't even imagine because we don't think of all these different companies every day. They're going to be gone. Think of the farmers. Think of the family farmers who are going to go under. They're being told to plow their fields under and kill their cattle and pour their milk on the ground at a time when people are hungry. Well, who's going to benefit from that? It's going to be the large industrial agricultural companies. They'll go in and buy up those distraught assets and those stranded assets. So this is something that is missing in the mainstream media conversation. When I turn on CBC or a mainstream outlet, I almost never hear any pushback. I never hear any probing questions. These reporters are just performing stenography for the politicians. They're just repeating whatever is being said uncritically. The things we're talking about are almost never talked about with them. You never hear somebody challenge the premier of a different province and say, now, wait a minute, you know, for example, it has come out that there are now over 30 strains of COVID-19. How many people know that? That came out from a Chinese study in a medical journal that was repeated and reported in the Jerusalem Post. And I found out about it because one of my members of Rainbow Warriors is a gentleman by the name of Brett Hawes. And Brett has his own podcast called the Holistic Health Masterclass. And he's a holistic health practitioner, but he knows a lot of virologists and he has a lot of science people on his show. He's very knowledgeable of himself. So he wrote an article that I edited and he published it on his website talking about these 30 mutations. He's been talking to virologists who are saying, don't think it's going to stop at 30. This thing's probably going to go to 100 strains. Well, if that's the case, we can't have are we seriously thinking that there will be a vaccine for this? Even if you believe in vaccines, and I'm vaccine skeptical, but you would have to be, like, we can't even keep track of the flu. You know, the flu in a good year is probably the flu shot is probably 40% effective. Last year, Brett told me it was something like -9. So that's for one virus that they try to target by custom blending and creating their vaccines. We have this thing that's mutating like crazy. It is a Frankenstein type of virus, and I think this does speak to the fact that it was produced in a lab and it is a germ weapon. Whether it was released intentionally, as I suspect, or whether it got out accidentally almost doesn't matter. So we need to go past this idea that there's going to be a vaccine and realize that we all need to start focusing on health and wellness and good nutrition and all the stuff we've been diverted from by, I just call it what it is, predatory capitalism.
You made a lot of great points there. I remember originally trying to figure out, what was going on with the virus. And I heard that I had, could have came from a lab. And then you find out about all these reports of this Wuhan lab literally studying the virus and how it's able to jump, or looking about how it could jump species. And I'm forgetting his name. I'll put it in the show notes what I remember, but there's a guy that did a really great report and documentary on it, and he was banned. And then they said he got in trouble for false news. And then they did a rebuttal because it was a powerful enough agency that they could do that, and saying, hey, everything that we shared is here, and they showed all their sources, but it doesn't matter. They still got, banned from Facebook and YouTube just for sharing that. I'm going to pull it up, make sure people can check it out, because I looked at that. I was like, wow, that's crazy. You know what I mean? And so I think one of the important things as you're discussing this is when you hear an idea, what I like to do is I like to have both sides, and then just get the information and keep absorbing the information. But then when I look at the mainstream news, the challenge is, number one, I know only a few companies, run our mainstream news in Canada and the US, around the world, and there's vested interest. That's okay. They're going to share the truth sometimes, hopefully. But also to look at it and just see what actual information you're getting beyond like what the agenda is, like how much meat and potatoes information and research and scientific data is there. Right. And so when you look at it, and you're kind of in the mainstream area, then you need your alternative sources. Look at that information, go see what you can verify. And then one of them usually has a little bit more weight, has a little bit more evidence. And I feel like that's what we need now, is we need everybody to do their investigation, because when censorship is happening so quickly, it's a scary thing. I spent some time in China. I was training with Shaolin monks over there, and
Oh, wow.
And culturally, I wasn't ready for it. And, the people, they wouldn't talk, where I was anyway, they wouldn't talk about religion or politics. They were terrified. There was no Facebook, there was no YouTube, and you had one voice coming down. You know what I mean? And it's interesting because you were talking about, you know, speaking out a little bit earlier. The doctors and the police officers that are speaking out about this, they lose their funding if they do that because they're going against the institutions, but they're getting fired immediately right now. And so if there's no agenda, if it's totally fine, why is there such aggressive censorship? Why is there such a consequence for questioning? Don't we live in a society we should question, especially when you're telling me, and you're putting it in your own voice? You know, people are giving Bill Gates, you know, some people say, oh, you're giving him a hard time. I was like, well, have you looked into it? Because when you look into it, the whole money trail is there and you can hear what he's saying. How has he become the World Health Authority? You know,
Yeah,
how has he become the planetary's #1 doctor and virologist, giving us, you know, the insights when many doctors, including Dr. Zach Bush, Dr. Bruce Lipton, Dr. Rashid Buttar, many doctors, like hundreds and thousands, you know, are speaking out saying, hey, you know, forced vaccination, a one size fits all for the entire 7 billion planet makes no sense. We do not have the science and understanding to back that. It makes no sense.
Some of the best, there's two guys who've done some really great work on this recently. There's a guy by the name of George Webb, who you can find on YouTube. Webb with 2 B's, has been looking at some of the, tracing some of the virus and how it might have emerged from various P4 labs. He's been doing some good work on that story. In terms of Bill Gates, I highly recommend people check out the Corbett Report. Jim Corbett, he has a website and you can also find his stuff on YouTube for now. And he's done 2 installments of what is going to be at least a 3-part series. The 3rd part should be out maybe later this week, I'm not sure. And it's incredible stuff. And he had already done a 2-part documentary about how Rockefeller had taken his money from Standard Oil and used it to corrupt the medical system and only promote a certain form of allopathic medicine, which I think of as kind of the pill and injection culture. And Rockefeller took over the medical system. He gave money to research hospitals and universities. And Corbett lays that all out in a 2-part documentary. But with the new Bill Gates story, he's showing how Gates is doing the same thing. And it's immensely profitable. It's almost like Gates had read the Rockefeller biography and got this play out of the same playbook, because it's shocking. It's almost identical. So here's Gates, who is his former business partner, Steve Wozniak, said that Gates is a total sociopath, okay? And it's not hard to understand that in order to be as successful as he is, you got to be somewhere on the spectrum, or you got to be a sociopath. I'm sorry, it's very difficult to become a almost trillionaire and be a normal person. But anyway, Gates he's following a strategy that has all the elements of the 4th Industrial Revolution in it, which I want to talk about in a minute. You know, he has patents with the immunization passports. He's got patents on vaccine technology. He's got fingers in every pot. People really ought to seek out Robert Kennedy Jr.'s tweet about what Bill Gates has done and the Gates and Melinda Gates Foundation has done in India, and the kids paralyzed with these polio vaccines that were very dangerous. It's an incredible story. I don't want to distract us too much with that, but there really is a plan at work. And there are 2 journalists who I've relied on. I don't want to pretend that I've done a lot of field work in this. I've done a bit, but 2 people that people ought to track down their work. One is a Canadian investigative journalist for whom I have the greatest respect. Her name is Corey Morningstar. And she wrote a series of articles that culminated in a book called The Manufacturing of Greta Thunberg. And that's a provocative title, but she, in that book and in that article series, and she has a website or a blog called Wrong Kind of Green. And she was showing how, and I have a 30-year background in environmental journalism, so I know that what she's writing is true because I've seen it myself up close, and it dovetails with some of what I've written in the past and some of the things I've even won awards for. She shows in these articles how the environmental movement has been hijacked by AstroTurf organizations. AstroTurf is just a play on the word grassroots. So there are all these pseudo sort of Al Gore type Davos oriented organizations that have realized that the greatest amount of money in the world to be accessed is locked up in the pension funds. There, I'm not even going to try to guess at what the number was that I read. It was in the hundreds of trillions of dollars. And this is the biggest amount of money in the world is in these pension funds. And so what these global capitalists are doing is they're saying, okay, we know we're kind of, the game is playing out with oil and gas. We know that there are sunset industries that we're trying to get as much out of as we can. They know they have to shift the game. And so what they've done is they've embraced the environmental movement, but they don't want to build stuff that you and I would approve. There's no democratic process in place. What they want to do is build things that enrich their shareholders. So it will be mega projects, it'll be huge hydroelectric dams, it'll be nuclear power plants, whatever you want to think of that. There'll be liquefied natural gas terminals. There'll be all kinds of things that will have a green camouflage, but they're actually schemes with the World Bank and the IMF that ultimately put the local populations into austerity, which they've done in Greece and they did in Venezuela and they've done all around the world. They're doing these sanctions now against Iran during a pandemic, which is just reprehensible. So anyway, Cory Morningstar correctly, in my opinion, identified that the big game that's on right now is for corporations that have no interest in the environment whatsoever to use the environmental movement as a fig leaf for accessing those huge amounts of money that are in the pension funds. And you're going to get a lot of people in the public mesmerized and distracted. Oh, the little girl with pigtails. Oh, how can we criticize her? It's a very good propaganda technique, because I found when I, like Cory, was writing about this, people would attack me as if I'm against Greta Thunberg. I have no problem with Greta Thunberg whatsoever. I think she's being manipulated and her parents are kind of interesting characters, but it's not about her. It's that we see the bigger picture and the game that's going on. And I got to tell you, it's very, very clever. Now, up until the pandemic, I was reading Morningstar and thinking, okay, that's it. It's about these guys accessing the pension funds with environmental projects or pseudo-environmental projects. Then I found out, I came across an American investigative journalist by the name of Whitney Webb. And it's another Webb, I think, with 2 B's. I don't think she's any relation to George, but they do the same kind of work. And Whitney Webb was interviewed by Jimmy Dore on the Jimmy Dore Show. So if you don't have the time to read her articles, go check out an episode of that. But she did a Freedom of Information Act request in the United States. And she found the most incredible document. I'm not going to be able to remember the document name at hand, but if you look up Whitney Webb, and her blog, you'll find it. It's a recent article. And what this document shows is it's incredible. It's a document that was produced by the security and surveillance apparatus agencies in the States, sitting down with the Silicon Valley companies and developing a strategy which is framed in the context of how to beat China in the new technology game. And what it describes is truly an Orwellian dystopia. they lay out in this secret document that we were never supposed to see. It lays out the whole roadmap of what we're being pushed toward. And this is where I'm putting my energy, because as much as we've discussed COVID-19, and COVID-19 has a very important role in this, I'm already like a good chess player trying to think 3, 4, 5 moves in advance. And people need to start getting educated about the fourth industrial revolution and the AI and digital technologies that are coming. And I won't describe them all, but if I just mention a couple of them, people will understand what I'm talking about. This is where you have, as they now have in downtown Calgary, if you can believe it, in a province with a conservative government that you would think would be concerned about pushing back on this. They have these 5G poles all over the place, and each one has a set, not just one, a whole set of Huawei facial recognition cameras. So that if you even walk through one of these commercial plazas in front of a building just once, they're going to get you from so many angles on video that they will be able to create a profile of your biometrics and get your physical data such that they don't need your fingerprint now to find you. They don't need even to see your face in a police lineup. They can identify you from a satellite from space looking straight down because of either the shape of your head from the top or this unique signature of how you walk with your body. And then, of course, that information gets processed through complex algorithms, and it goes into being matched up with your visa statements, your bank statements, all the things that are being recorded when you speak to Alexa or Siri, or maybe your smart TV or your Nest thermostat, all of which have microphones in them. We are already being heavily, heavily surveilled. This is just the beginning of this Orwellian situation. And the term for it, I'm sure a lot of the audience has heard of Naomi Klein's term disaster capitalism. And I think of what we're going through right now as disaster capitalism. But there's a new word which I think is even better, and it's called surveillance capitalism. And you can find a female professor who has written a book, I forget her name offhand, and she's got a 50-minute video on YouTube about that, and it's called Surveillance Capitalism. And if you watch that video, I haven't read the book yet, but I intend to, and you start putting that together with some of the other things we've been talking about, we are being moved into a very different reality than the one we're in right now. And it is not being done through any kind of democratic process whatsoever. Consider that one of the reasons that the kids are being kept out of school is this is a dress rehearsal. This is an experiment, because ultimately, and this Whitney Webb document expounds on this, they want us to have teachers over the internet. They want to end the classroom as we know it. They have a whole education plan, and guess who has his finger in that pie? Bill Gates. He's a major benefactor of that. They want you to not go to the family doctor anymore. You're going to be diagnosed over the internet by Watson, okay? And things like the doctor, this classroom, the traditional classroom, those are called legacy issues. They are literally being framed as, oh, that's stuff that belongs to the old third industrial revolution. That's an old hat. We're burying that in the past. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not opposed to good internet speeds and things like that. But this is not what this is about. This is about control, and it's about mining you and me as data. And so every time that we interact with Facebook or our cell phones or anything like that, we're giving a tremendous amount of data to these companies, and that data is being sold. But I'll pause for breath in a second, let you get a word in, but I'll just finish that thought by saying the definition of fascism, the classic definition, is when large corporations collude with large government in serving their own needs and not the needs of the people. And I think you could make a very good case that we are moving into a new form of fascism where our governments and large corporations are not responsive to the needs of the people. It's an oligarchy, or what we could now properly call a technocracy. And we're moving into an era of technocracy in which our rights are going to be pretty much non-existent. We have Julian Assange in jail, which is just like a scene out of 1984. And as long as Julian Assange is in jail and these undemocratic technologies are being rolled out and the 5G towers are being installed all around where I live while I'm in lockdown and I can't get out and protest, although I do. This is very frightening. So there's COVID-19, but people really need to get up to speed on surveillance capitalism and the technologies that are being put in place right now while we are supposedly staying at home and spending time with our families and bonding and watching TV together. Like, screw that. There's millions of people on the brink of starvation around the world. And I have spent some time with my family, but I've been using this time to organize and to start thinking through how we push back against this. Because when we come out of lockdown, I swear to God, we're entering into a new world. And it's not a world that I want to live in. Okay, that's the end of my speech.
Wow, well, you definitely touched on a lot of very important topics. I think some of the listeners of my show are going to definitely know about the surveillance. Interestingly, today, in one of the groups that I'm in, I got this little video said, hey, just so you know, Facebook has been tracking everything that you do off of Facebook. And I kind of assume that, you know, I just assume it at this time, but I'm like, oh, I can shut it off. And so I look, and lo and behold, when I'm not on Facebook, they're tracking all of my stuff. And I grabbed my girlfriend's phone. I said, let me see that. And it showed everything that she had there too. And so if you go on my Facebook, I have a video for how you can turn that off. And you probably turn it off, but they probably still collect that data anyway, you know? And so you're absolutely right about being very concerned with the direction that we're going in with surveillance, the ID passports. You know, you have Elon Musk and, you know, Bill Gates in the chip, and it's literally in the patent. It has a 666 in it. You know, it's like, you can't make this stuff up. This is absolutely absurd. And there's so much going on where, you know, when we're looking at what's going on, everybody's talking about the coronavirus. What do we not know? Because when you look at the global elite and what they do and these big corporations, and that's a great way to put it. I just say, hey, it's these big corporations and these people that are just, they might not have your best interests at heart. And that's for some people, that's hard to understand, that, hey, maybe these big, powerful people don't care that much about you, because when 9.1 million people die of starvation, or, you know, if you look at, you know, what Black people have gone through over time, it's not hard for them to say, hey, you know, you shouldn't trust your government. You know what I mean? Like, we've been through this, but, you know, people have grown up in privilege. You know, they're like, oh, no, the government's definitely on your side. Or, you know, anyone's from a third world country or gone through that, they're like, man, you know, you don't trust your government because, you know, it's about power, and this is a power game. And if we don't wake up to these surveillance systems, to these, you know, testing martial law. And my concern with this is, I'm hoping the people wake up and we can do something about it, because they've baked the second wave into the cake, as Corbett report kind of suggests, is like, oh, the second wave is going to be worse. Yeah. When you increase stress, that is the highest indicator of disease. The placebo is a very incredible effect. It works to cure, and it also works to create illness. If you keep thinking about illness,
placebo is incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
I think what we're touching on here, we've been skirting around an idea which I keep plugging these other journalists, because I want people to have this awareness, because there's so few voices right now. Honestly, I could count on these two hands the number of journalists who I routinely listen to. And one of my favorites is the Australian blogger who you may have heard of, Caitlin Johnstone. And Caitlin Johnstone, if any of your listeners are not familiar with her, I urge you to start tracking her on her Patreon account or wherever. And she refers very often to something that's a pet theme of mine, which is narrative management. And what the powers that be realized a long time ago, especially after the protests against the Vietnam War, needed to do this. If you're the CIA, the FBI, MI6, or in Canada, the RCMP or CSIS, or any of these groups, the name of the game is narrative management. Because if you can control the narrative, then you can achieve the corporate outcomes and the state/corporate outcomes that these colluding entities want to achieve, which seems to have a lot to do with control and exploitation and super profits for an oligarchy. And we all know, well, maybe you don't all know, but there's something called the Princeton study, which a few years reviewed all of the legislation in the US at the municipal, state, and federal level, and found out that, you know, something like 98% of all the policies and rules favored the wealthy 1% and were not in the public interest. So the fact that it's not just a dramatic statement to say, oh, we no longer live in a democracy. In the United States, and I would hazard to say most other industrialized countries, we now live in a form of oligarchy. Where I first ran into the whole issue of narrative management on steroids was when I did a deep dive into the proxy war on Syria. We don't need to get bogged down in that, but it's worth mentioning because a lot of people don't realize. The only reason that Obama did not bomb Syria or invade, or he did bomb it, but the only reason he didn't send in ground troops was because Seymour Hersh, the famous Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who exposed the My Lai massacre, among other things, he wrote a series of articles that he could only get published in the freaking London Review of Books. I mean, these articles should have been on the front page of the Washington Post if that was not a corrupt entity owned by Jeff Bezos, who sits on a Pentagon board. But one was called The Red Line and the Rat Line, and the other was called Who's Sarin? And what he did is he exposed that the West, that is to say the Western intelligence agencies and the Pentagon and so on, we were supplying poison gas, or we were making the circumstances copacetic such that the so-called rebels or militants, some would call them terrorists, these foreign proxy armies that the West has trained, financed, and deployed in Syria, were using this gas against the people and not President Assad. I don't want to get into whether Assad's a nice guy or not. It's really beside the point. Over 500,000 Syrians have lost their lives in a war that was only ever about hegemony and competing gas and oil pipelines or gas pipelines. And there's a sort of Israeli-Saudi component to sponsor this. And basically the Saudis, and this all came out through WikiLeaks. And now I really do mean WikiLeaks and not Wikipedia. It came out that the Israelis, many years before the Syrian conflict began, the Saudis had said, we will pay for you to invade it, and you, the United States, you organize it on the ground. So the war on Syria has been a dirty war, and it's been a war that has not been reported properly to people in the West. And this is really where I lost my innocence about the Western media. And I would see, I guess maybe what is the most efficient image I can convey to convey the depths of the deception about that country. And the best example is this. There's an organization most of people have heard of, I'm sure, called the OPCW, which is the Organization for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons. And they went in to investigate the supposed gas attack in Douma in Syria. Now, it sounds like I'm off topic, but you'll see how this ties in. And what happened was the inspectors went in and they found that what had been purported to be a canister of gas, poison gas dropped from a plane or a helicopter, had actually been staged. And there was lots of evidence that it hadn't, in fact, crashed through the roof of this building, but had been placed there. And I won't get into it. But the inspector's report was falsified by people higher up in the organization. So here we have a United Nations agency suppressing the information discovered by its own investigators through the OPCW in order to frame President Assad, in order to legitimate the ongoing proxy war against that country. This is a scandal of enormous proportions. This is front page news. The OPCW falsifying, and what happened was its reporters or its agents who had done, its professional inspectors came out, and some of them became whistleblowers, and they've come out and said that this happened. You know that not a single mainstream outlet in the world has reported that story. Not a single major television, radio station, network, newspaper, not a single name brand that you can think of. Now that to me tells me that the extent to which the media is now no longer a free press. It is working in cahoots fully with this superstructure of this corporate government collusion. And therefore, we have to look very carefully where we get our information from. Now, that same media that not only lied to us for 8 years of the Syrian conflict, during which I'll just throw one other factoid at you. In a single year, a Pentagon defense agency spent $500 million on propaganda. That $500 million buys you a lot of propaganda. A lot of those images that we've seen of terrorists supposedly sawing off the heads of captured Westerners, a lot of that stuff was green screen. A lot of that stuff was produced by us. Like, people just don't realize this. The little girl supposedly in Aleppo who was in fear for her life, she was not even in Syria. Those events were staged from outside the country. Anyway, I don't want to get lost in detail on that. But when you consider the lie about the OPCW investigation of Douma, and you think that that same media is the one that's reporting to us about COVID-19, it's that same media that's repeating the talking points from the government that we must shelter in place, and we must not question the authorities, and we must take a vaccine, and so on and on and on. That same media is also carrying water for the rollout of the 5G technology, which I would like to talk about in a moment, and the other technologies of the fourth industrial revolution, which superficially sound great: self-driving cars, super fast internet speeds. But I've been looking into that, and there's more than 4,000 suppressed, some say 10,000, but I'll just go with 4,000 suppressed safety studies that show that 5G technology causes cancer and a host of other diseases.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you made a lot of great points there. I think that that's a tough pill for people to swallow sometimes when they say, oh, you know, the mainstream might not be telling you the truth, and it isn't. You could look up Operation Mockingbird. A lot of documentaries come out there and they talk about how the CIA infiltrated the news and would just hand bags of money. This was in Stephen Greer's documentary. It's been in many documentaries.
The Church Street Commission is another one that they investigated and found that the CIA had infiltrated all the newsrooms. And there's no evidence that that ever stopped, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And it's just money to create, you know, an agenda to move something forward that might not be of our best interest. And when you understand that the news isn't telling you the truth, that's not where, like, not everything obviously you see is false, but you need to get information outside of that alone, for sure. That's a full stop. You have to go outside just the mainstream narrative to find independent news, independent reporters, because once money gets involved, there's going to be now an agenda and a certain narrative that gets pushed forward. And you can look, I've been posting this documentary over and over again, but The Century of Self by Edward Bernays, and understanding, or, you know, about Edward Bernays and how he, you know, how brilliant he was, Sigmund Freud's nephew, and using propaganda techniques. And these are, a lot of these things are ancient techniques, you know, like this is the rulers of the world have known these things. It's just that it's not something you think about every single day, but it's something that people need to kind of wake up to, because we got to figure out if these new legislations, if these new technologies are good for us or not good for us. And if we're going to lock down, and it's interesting too, because you look at the lockdown and we see how fragile the system is, then alone, you know, not going into banking and how, you know, the whole financial system is super corrupt, and it only benefits a few very, very well. And they're still going to be fine. Like you shared that example, that one small example of, like, we won't even put your payment at the end for add another 3 months. Banks still want to get paid by everybody. So we're just going to let everybody go homeless, and you're going to continue to be billionaires, and the big governments are going to bail out banks and corporations and all these things.
In Canada, I just heard today, Trudeau announced, I couldn't believe my ears. He's announced these bridge loans for the largest corporations in Canada so that they can keep their employees employed. Well, that's incredible. Why are you bailing out and helping the largest corporations? The largest employer in Canada, as elsewhere, is small and medium-sized businesses. So where's the money for them? I know maybe there is some in Canada. I know in the United States what they did. It was the biggest heist in world history. It was bigger than the 2008 mortgage fraud bailout. What happened was, and the US Congress and Senate passed a stimulus bill. They've done 4 of them now. In the first one, they basically gave $500 billion to the largest corporations in the States. And that money, you have to understand, gets leveraged with the US Fed and Treasury. And it got turned immediately into $4.2 trillion. That money went directly to the 1,000 wealthiest families and corporations in the United States. They didn't have to wait for months for their measly one-time $1,200 check that Democrat Speaker Nancy Pelosi wanted means tested. Literally, the Democratic Party in the United States is by and large to the right of Trump, if you can believe it. And every one of those progressives, Ilhan Omar and AOC and Bernie Sanders, who were supposedly the squad and they're the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, they all voted for this. They say they didn't, but they did, because it was a voice vote, and they went for that so there wouldn't be a record. So it was, I think there was only one US senator that opposed it. Anyway, the point is, there was this bipartisan support for a bill that bailed out the elites and gave them the money to go around for the next 2 years, hoovering up all these distressed corporations and consolidating their power. So that's why I call it Plandemic, COVID-19 and the Corporate Coup D'État. We are living through a corporate coup d'etat. And if people in Canada or Australia or the UK think it's any different, you're kidding yourselves. There is an immense consolidation of power going on. And our governments are giving the wealthy companies the money to do it, which only exacerbates the problem. I personally know lots of people who said to me months ago, if this lockdown goes for another 2 weeks, we're done. And that was months ago. And if this continues, as I expect, at least for certain sectors of the economy, for another month or more, we're not going to see the devastation. We don't see the bread lines, but it's because of the way the world is today. But, you know, you got to remember in the 1930s, it took something like 2 or 3 years to get to something like 30% unemployment. We've got to that in a matter of weeks. So we're in an economic depression. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. The world economy has been devastated, and the governments are actually propping up the stock market, not the real economy. And you've got it. I don't know how much of this was by design with respect to this pandemic, but what I do know is that at the very same week that the information started to leak out about this virus coming from this Wuhan lab, and remember when it first came out, it was a little bit nebulous and we didn't really know what was going on. But then there was that 1 week where it became a real story and people started to become aware. That same week, hundreds and hundreds of executives resigned their jobs from Wall Street. They resigned their jobs from some of the largest corporations. Why did they do that? They did it so that they could exercise their stock options and short the market, because the word obviously traveled that there was going to be this downturn. They knew since last fall that there was going to be a huge stock market correction because something called the bond yield curve had inverted, which is a 100% predictor of a recession and a stock market, a bear market. That had happened last fall. And usually there's an economic correction every 7 or 8 years in a capitalist system. We're actually at the end of a 90-year interest cycle, and we went, 10, 11, 12 years since the last downturn. So we were ready for a big one. So while the rest of us were sitting like chumps, these executives exercised their share options. They got rich, they shorted the market. The hedge fund managers made billions, I'm sure, and we'll be hearing about this in some Michael Moore documentary 5 years from now. And now they're going to use all this money that they've got to go and consolidate the market further, consolidate the assets further. It's devastating, and they're getting helped every step of the way by governments. And I'll tell you, the liberal governments and the democratic governments are just as bad as the conservative or Republican ones. They're really not different because they all answer to their corporate masters now. So, it's a very difficult situation we're in. And I do want to mention something, and yes, I'm going to shamelessly plug my book because why not? But it actually pertains to what we're talking about. I'll just mention it. You mentioned it in the intro. I wrote this book a couple of years ago called The Year of Drinking Magic, 12 Ceremonies with the Vine of Souls, which you can buy on Amazon or you can order it through a bookstore. That book won the 2018 silver medal from the Independent Book Publishers Association. Now, I'm not telling you this because I'm trying to sell books and make money. I donate my royalties from that book to the Amazon Rainforest Conservancy, as you mentioned at the start. But this book and what I'm about is the consciousness shift. This is a book about my explorations of shamanism and plant shamanism and my work with what some people would just know as psychedelics. And I am part of the psychedelic renaissance, and I'm happy to share that. I'm not one of these people that's uptight about talking about it. And we not only need to push back against the fourth industrial revolution and some of its excessive and dangerous technologies. I'm okay with some of the ones that aren't dangerous, but a lot of them are. But we need to start visualizing the new world that we want. I too want a new world order. I just don't want it to be the one that Gates is imagining and some of his friends. And I think we need to start really investing in community, in local food production. I mean, the most revolutionary thing you could do today is have a garden and start growing some of your own food. I've never done any of that. I don't have a green thumb, but I fully intend to start doing that kind of stuff. We need to start getting local We need to invest in our friendships. And as Buckminster Fuller said, and I'm going to really butcher this, but he said something to the effect that we don't get to where we want to go by just criticizing what is. You have to build what you want. You have to build the better thing, and then people will naturally come to it. So as we push back against the technocracy, we can't just be against something. We need to be for something. And figuring out what we're for is what I'm now trying to turn more of my attention to. So we've talked a lot about this really dark stuff, but we need to really get people focused on the fact that there is a spiritual renaissance going on as well. There is a lot of awakening going on. It was interesting, actually, with the Brian Rose interview with David Icke, that even though there were parts of that I didn't agree with, he spent about the last 20 or 30 minutes talking about something that most people would know as non-duality or non-dual yogic philosophy. The idea that there is no physical world per se, but we are all local manifestations of an infinite single consciousness. That sounds pretty out there, but that's certainly what my own investigations and my work with plants like ayahuasca has shown me as well. So, and what I love about this, and now I'm thinking I'm actually paraphrasing something Terence McKenna said in one of his talks, you cannot win against the establishment by attacking it head on, because they have all kinds of ways to deal with us. And as John Lennon said, if you go at this with violence, they know how to handle you. But when we start looking at things like non-dual philosophy, and we start talking about organic farming and buying, everything within 100 miles kind of philosophy, and we start working with psychedelics or shamanic visionary plants that open us up to other realms and other modalities of consciousness, it represents an orthogonal or sideways attack against the battleship for which it doesn't have a defense. So I have been going to some of the weekly protests at Queen's Park, and I have been getting out there. But ultimately, that's not really where the solution lies. The solution lies in building communities of conscious awareness in these areas that I'm talking about. And that's how we're going to win over the long term. We have some short-term battles ahead of us. We have to stop these 5G towers being put up. Somebody told me that 50 of them were burned in Quebec yesterday. I don't know if that's true, but that sort of thing is coming. I can imagine, I'm not encouraging violence, but it wouldn't surprise me if you're going to have people going out with guns and shooting these things from distance. I mean, they're so, I just don't even know what corporate Canada is thinking. When they install this stuff and people start getting the nosebleeds and the headaches and the mysterious feelings of unwellness, they're going to start pushing back against this. There's a theory that COVID-19 is cover for those symptoms, and that might actually be the case. Wuhan is the Chinese city that had the biggest rollout of 5G. So maybe but I don't really buy that as a long-term explanation, because that would fall apart eventually, because eventually this virus will go away, and then people will be left with the 5G, and they'll figure out that that's what's making them sick. But it's certainly it's very helpful for the Rogers and the Bells and the Shaws and any telecom you can think of. I'm just talking about Canadian companies. I know they're Verizon and other things in the States. Yeah, so we've got short-term strategic things we have to do, but we have a much longer, bigger movement to start, which is why I called my group Rainbow Warriors, because it speaks to that legend. I know it's apocryphal, but that there will be a day when the Earth's animals and plants and creatures will be in great distress. and there will be a group from different tribes, the different skin colors, the red skin, the yellow, the white, the brown, the black, and we will come together and we will, like Noah with his ark, we will save nature. This is something that we have to step up and into right now. And I realized when I had this thought of Bob Hunter forming Greenpeace, I had this very profound thought of, he's not alive. So I have to step into that role. Not just me, but all people of consciousness have to step into this right now. It's not 10 years from now. It's not 20 years from now. It's not 5 years from now. It's right now, today. You've got to get involved. We cannot sit this one out, people. When I went to the Queen's Park protest last weekend and the weekends before, I say to myself, where are the young people? Usually it's the university age kids that are out. They were the ones leading the Woodstock and the Vietnam protests. And I don't know what they're doing. They're totally missing in action. I only saw a handful of them there. And I congratulated them on being there. But I don't know what they're doing. Are they at home playing their video games? I'm sure they're going to be thrilled when the virtual reality technology comes out. And there is an argument to be made that this is the best possible situation if you're a Silicon Valley company and you've invested all your treasure in virtual reality headsets and escaping into virtual reality. Being locked down in our homes is the perfect training ground to prepare us for that. And I'm afraid that the young people are going to be like the kids in that famous story by Hans Christian Andersen. They're going to follow the Pied Piper of technology into the mountain, and the mountain's going to close behind them. How's that for an image? And our young people are going to disappear into this technological pseudo-reality when they need to be getting out in nature. They need to be enjoying music with each other. All the things that we're being told not to do.
Yeah, well, you shared a lot there. I absolutely agree with all of it. I think we're in very fascinating times. I was going to ask your question. I was going to ask you a question on potential solutions, because when I look at everything going on, it's pretty frightening, and I'm seeing what you're seeing as well. I do think that this is an opportunity for everybody to participate, to wake up, to ask questions, because this is something that needs to be questioned and it needs to be investigated, and we all need to take our responsibility for that. And when you do your own investigation, you're going to come to the same conclusions many of us had, and there is something to be concerned about. There's a lot of things that just don't add up. And so what are the solutions, and can we come together to bring those solutions? We see now how fragile our system is and how easily it can crash. And people are like, oh, well, how much food do I get? Where do I get food? How the heck is food made? And when we can't even provide for ourselves, we're going to have to go to these outside sources, whether it's the government or, something else, to get food, when we as a few people could grow a garden and figure it out and have a good life with everything we need. But we live in this world, it seems, of materialism and greed. And so it's taking a step back. And like you said, standing up. I don't think we can play on the sidelines right now. I think we just touched the surface on so much information. I know you can go deeper on each and every one, and there's still a lot of topics that we can cover, but I have to get up to my little one in a minute. So I wanted to ask you, is there anything that you wish that I'd asked or that you want to touch on? And what do you think we can do? Yeah, it's kind of a vague question, so feel free to elaborate. But if we missed anything you feel like is important, please share that. And what do we do to move forward to create this solution? Because I agree with imagining the most ideal narrative. And we don't need a government to allow us to do that. We don't need an okay. We literally need a small groups of people, small communities, just working together hand in hand and like, all right, what are the basics? Food, water, shelter. Cool. Let's sort that out. Then everything becomes a bonus. But 3-4 months ago or 2 months ago, geez, I don't even know how long we've been into it. People are like, what? No, I need this and I need that and I need all these other things and I need this type of car and a leather couch. Right now, people are like, holy crap, we're losing our businesses, we're losing our homes. I'm scared of the outdoors. We need a social distance. A lot of that, for me, they're trying to, the narrative, it pisses me off because people buy into it. And I'm like, sweet Lord, don't hug your neighbor. We need that. Humans need that. And I don't care if they're like, humans are the most toxic thing. It's ridiculous. If you look in history and how powerful our immune systems and how powerful we are, and it's proven to be 2%, mortality is the highest it is. It's like, we can hug our neighbors, we can hug our mothers and our fathers. And I have such sadness and compassion for those, elderly people who I've seen some images where their families are too close or to let them pass over. They don't even, they're not even with their loved ones to pass over. This is the time.
This is one of the great outrages of our time.
Yeah.
Is that elderly people are being, I'm going to get choked up even thinking about this. They're dying alone because their family members are not allowed. I don't know if this is more of a US thing. I don't know how extensive this is in Canada, but we know this disease affects the elderly with pre-existing conditions, and they are dying alone because their family members are not allowed to visit them. I think this is going to be something that we're going to look back on and with great shame, and rightfully so. This is the ultimately dehumanizing quality. And I do not have this virus, and I have friends who do not have it, and we hug each other, and we are not accepting this new normal of social distancing, which does not work anyway. But I don't want to split hairs. Oh, some people are wearing masks, some are not wearing masks. Everybody's divided on all these different narratives. Yes, we've gone as long as I think we should. I will just leave your audience with a couple of thoughts about practical things to do. One, anything that the government and YouTube is censoring is something you must seek out and watch and read, because almost everything that I've seen taken down is the best material. It's those 2 doctors in California that came out and reported from their own data. There's Dr. Mikovits. There's anything from Robert Kennedy Jr. and his Children's Health Defense Organization. Start tapping into those alternative sources. I've named some alternative journalists that you can look at. There's Aaron Mate, Jimmy Dore, Max Blumenthal, Abby Martin, Caitlin Johnstone, John Pilger. There's some voices that you can truly rely on. And Dr. Mikovits and Dr. Bruce Lipton and these people with epigenetics, and they're teaching us about how to reconnect with our own inner capacity for wellness that evolved over millions of years. So there's that. And then there's some practical things I want people to consider. Investigate 5G. Do not accept when you just talk to one of your friends who's in that world of technology who will say, oh no, it's people fear new technology and they're just Luddites, don't worry about it. No, I've looked into this. 5G has some very, very dangerous frequencies, and it is a different technology than 4G, and it is going on top of 4G. So you're going to continue to get all the 4G radiation, which is already causing more harm than we know. And we're also going to get the 5G. So consider getting 5G stickers made with a red line through them and put them up in your neighborhood. Get fact sheets and put them up on telephone poles. This is going to have to be fought neighborhood by neighborhood and community by community. Don't just put your trust in people at the provincial and federal level winning this on your behalf. I mean, hopefully some of that will happen too, but look at the local level, talk to your neighbors, organize locally, oppose 5G in your community, pending a thorough safety review. And start educating your neighbors about the risks of a vaccine that they're already injecting into people on an experimental basis. We don't have a vaccine for SARS, and that was almost 20 years ago. There has never been a successful vaccine for a coronavirus, and there probably never will be. So you don't have to become an anti-vaxxer. Get educated about how a vaccine would or would not work for a coronavirus, and start asking critical questions. And then also start thinking about the things that you don't need to ask your government for permission to do. For instance, if we get a new digital currency and a universal basic income, that sounds great, but that can be used to manipulate people. That money can be deducted out of your account if you don't do what the government tells you to. So I see us moving to more of an economy of barter. So I will paint your living room if you give my son a massage, this kind of thing. Like, we need to get back to barter. We need to cut out the middleman. We need to cut out the banks, and we need to cut out the government. There's actually a heck of a lot of things we can do without being like slaves in a master-slave relationship with the government and these corporations. We can take back our agency, and we can do things locally, and we don't have to go back to the Stone Age. We just need to reprise some of that spirit that our grandparents had, who lived through the Great Depression and learned to do more with less. And I think I'll leave it there. I think I've indulged your time enough, and I think our audience is probably at the saturation point. But this has been a great pleasure, and I look forward to doing this again sometime when there's more news for us to chew over.
Well, I appreciate you. Yeah, I appreciate you coming on the show and sharing what you shared. I know that you're kind of scratching the surface on a lot of this stuff because you've done some great investigative work. I've read some of your articles and what you've been publishing. You've been following this pretty intensely. And so it takes a lot of effort to kind of understand and then be confident in this stuff. And then once you kind of have a handle on it, you're staying on top of it because things are changing every single day. And you're then able to see the narrative and propaganda versus what is actually happening. And then, as you said, try to get a step or two ahead of it so we can create a solution. Because right now, a lot of people are living in fear, and we don't want to live in fear, but we also don't want to live in ignorance. You know, if the 5G is going to hurt us and not be positive, we should know about that. And if the coronavirus is super, super deadly and it's going to kill all of us, I want to know about that. But I want to know the truth. I want to know, if it's reasonable to be doing what we're doing, and what are the causes and effects of a lockdown? Is there something behind that? And that's one thing a lot of people don't really take into question. They don't question their government, they don't question the media, and they don't question experts. And that's part of the conditioning that I grew up with. And you should always question the government. If you look at history, you should always question authority, because if you don't, they can just kind of run amok. And you can look at any history book to figure that out. And the solution is with the people. What do we want? You know, what is the best narrative that can come out of this? What are we learning? What's important to us? How do we work with our community? How do we work with our neighbors? How do we get clear on what kind of world we want to live in, and ensure that we do that as a people through our actions and our participation? And if we can do that, we can create something that we are proud of. And that's all it takes is participation. We don't need a government or a degree or any outside thing to say that we need to do that. We just need to get clear on what our values are, what do we want to build, and how do we want to live, and start to build this new thing. So it's interesting times. I appreciate all those amazing resources, your time, your effort. If people want to follow your work and your reporting and everything you're putting out, where should they go?
Well, like I say, I'm in a number of places, but probably the best place to start, and I apologize, the website is not everything it could be, but my main article is on there, and some other things. It's the hypnosis, or I don't know if you can put it in the show notes, but
Yep.
hypnosis.co, and you could even just search on my name, Guy Crittenden blog, or Guy Crittenden Syria, or Guy Crittenden, I don't know, a word like pandemic or COVID, and you'll find me And yeah, I intend to keep producing material and reporting the truth as much as I can and giving a perspective and helping elevate us all into the life that we want for ourselves at a human scale with the technologies that we democratically approve and select, not things that are imposed on us because it's good for some shareholders who are right now building bunkers inside of former nuclear launch pads because they know what's coming at them. All right. Thank you.
Nice ending. I'm gonna have to ask you about that. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you in the next episode.
All right, brother. Namaste.